Daniel, for your reading. Good afternoon. I'm deeply saddened to speak on behalf of Mark Fisher. I'm going to read from the interview, as I'm going to try to voice his voice as good as I can. I think that we can say that capitalist realism has effaced not only its own historicity and contingency, but also its own existence as an ideological constellation. You could say that effacement is what defines capitalist realism. The hegemonic field which capitalist realism secures and intensifies is one in which politics itself has been disappeared. What capitalist realism consolidates is the idea that we are in the era of the post-political, that the big ideological conflicts are over, and the issues that remain largely concern who is to administrate the new consensus. Of course, there is nothing more ideological than the idea that we've moved beyond ideology. It has become increasingly clearer over the last few years, especially since 2008, that the essentially 1990s idea of the post-political and the post-ideological was always a cover for neoliberal hegemony. The increased use of the term neoliberalism since 2000 is a symptom of the weakening power of neoliberalism. The more it is named, the less its doctrines can pose as post-political. Nevertheless, the notion of the post-political isn't just an ideological ruse. Membership of political parties and trade unions really is declining. It's a commonplace that the major political parties in the UK and the US are scarcely distinguishable from one another. Very few people identify themselves as political. Given this context, there's something misleading about describing capitalist realism, as I myself tend to, as the belief that capitalism is about describing, as the belief that capitalism is the only viable political economic system. Capitalist realism could perhaps better be seen as a set of behaviors and affects that arise from this belief. The dominance of capitalism, the inability to imagine an alternative to it, now constitute a sort of invisible horizon. Few explicitly think about capitalism as such. The disappearance of alternatives, even if only imaginary alternatives, make it much harder to apprehend capitalism as a specific contingent system. Capitalist realism, as I have understood it, entails this deep embedding in a world, or a set of worlds, in which capitalism is massively naturalized. Capitalist realism doesn't appear in the first instance, then as a political position. It emerges instead as a pragmatic adjustment. This is the way things are now. This sense of resignation, of fatalism, is crucial to the realism. Here we can distinguish between neoliberalism and capitalist realism. Capitalist realism isn't the direct endorsement of neoliberal doctrine. It's the idea that, whether we like it or not, the world is governed by neoliberal ideas, and that won't change. There is no point fighting the inevitable. It's not an accident that I came to the idea of capitalist realism while working in a further education college at the height of Blairism. New Labour was the paradigmatic example of a formerly left-wing party capitulating to capitalist realism. For it must be recognized that capitalist realism is a pathology of the left. It is the left which has had to tell itself the story that there's no point struggling for an alternative to capitalism. In other words, capitalist realism is the left ascotizing in the narrative that the new right is so aggressively pushed in the 1980s. Thatcher was right to claim Blair as her greatest achievement. Labour's painful journey from the unelectability in the 1980s to government in the 1990s ended up consummately proving Thatcher's point that there is no alternative. When Thatcher first made that remark, she was saying that there is no viable alternative to neoliberal capitalism. By 1997, there was no imaginable alternative. In the further education sector where I worked, you could see the practical and existential consequences of all this. There was an acceptance amongst managers of the inevitability that education would increasingly be modeled on business. Some managers would typically introduce new procedures by explicitly saying that they didn't themselves think they were a good idea, but what could you do? This was how things were to be done now, and the easiest option all around would be for us to go through the motions. We didn't have to believe it, we only had to act as if we believed it. The idea that our inner beliefs mattered more than what we were publicly professing at work was crucial to capitalist realism. We could have left-wing convictions and a left-wing self-image, provided these didn't impinge on work in any significant way. This was ideology in the old Althusserlian sense. We were required to use a certain language and engage in particular ritualized behaviors, but none of this mattered because we didn't really believe in any of it. But of course, the very privileging of inner, subjective states over the public was itself an ideological move. Capitalist realism, then, is essentially about the depoliticizations of work and more broadly, of everyday life. That's one of the saddest effects of the subduing of unions. At work, we learn to accept worsening pay and conditions as just the way things are in a competitive, globalized world. Politics becomes something that we engage in only at the ballot box, if we even consider that to be worthwhile. And many of us who vote think of it as a pointless, impotent act. Or, if we're more of an activist bent, it's something that we do at protests of various kinds. In either case, work becomes decoupled from politics. One benefit of the occupations that happened in educational institutions as part of the anti-fees movement in the UK in 2010 was that they remade the link between work and politics. In summary then, I think it's best not to see capitalist realism as a political position, but as something which precludes political involvement and identification. It therefore follows that one of the most effective first steps in the struggle against capitalist realism will be the invention of new ways in which people can become involved with politics. Sorry, give me a second. This seems to me to represent a major tension in capitalist culture at the moment. On the one hand, as you say, it is increasingly difficult to separate life from work. In conditions of mandatory entrepreneurialism, where we are continually enjoined to sell ourselves, it is in one sense almost impossible to set up the cordon sanitaire to which you refer. I'm sorry, I think I'm reading a reply to an interview. I should ask, read the question too.